FCS Nation Radio. FCS Nation Radio. I am Coach Gene Clemens, joined with the commissioner of the SoCon of the Southern Conference, Michael Cross. Commissioner Cross, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, Gene. Good to see you.
Absolutely, and good to see you, and great to be talking after what was, in my opinion, one of the best media days that I've been to. I really want to send kudos out to you and all of your staff and all of the people who really worked to make that a really enjoyable one-day event. Sometimes when you're trying to condense everybody into a day, it could be a long and arduous day, and obviously it was long, but very well put together. Everything seemed to run smooth. There was not a coach or a player that I wasn't able to get contact with, and I really do appreciate that.
Thanks, Gene. Appreciate it. Yeah, we, credit to the staff. We put a lot of thought into it. For your listeners who aren't aware, I started in this role on July 1, and Media Day was about a month afterward. And, we got after it really quickly and talked about what are we trying to do? What's the tone we're trying to set? What are we trying to accomplish? And I'm glad to hear from you, and we've heard from others that it turned out to be a successful day and allowed all of you to do the types of things you need to do to talk about the Southern Conference in a productive way. So thanks for being there.
Absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to get into was the growing parity in the conference. I think there's levels to when you get respectability as far as like a national conference, and that's important because I think a lot of times teams will get playoff seedings based just on the perception of the strength of the conference. For instance, the Missouri Valley Football Conference, they usually get a lot of teams because the perception is that conference is really good. So you might see a team with 3 losses, possibly even 4 losses get into a playoffs, similar to what the Big Sky is, and at some points the CAA was. But the SoCon has slowly been building up, and you see a lot more parity in the conference these days. Do you think that that's something that is going to help all of your teams kind of have a little bit better national view?
Well, that's an interesting question, Gene, and I think the answer is maybe. And the reason is, our conference, unlike some of the other conferences that you mentioned, everybody plays everyone, and parity is really helpful in some ways and talks about depth of the conference, the strength of our teams, and all of that starts with, quality coaches and having quality student athletes, and institutional investment. But when everybody plays everybody and you've got parity, you start to get, varying levels of outcomes that don't necessarily project to, records that have 1 loss or 2 losses. So there's some trickiness to the parity, but to your overarching point, I do think we have a lot of parity in the conference. We've got, 3 or 4 teams that are, ranked, receiving votes. Even a team, I'm going to talk about VMI for a minute here. I mean, VMI, got a new coach with Danny Rocco, and, they're 3-3, they're 2-1 in conference play, and they're in a good place right now. They're doing things that make sense. Their athletes are bought in, and they opened the season against Davidson. I was at that game, had a chance to see them perform really well. And they beat Davidson, which is, probably considered the likely Pioneer Conference champion. We'll see how their games play out. But top to bottom, Furman, Western Carolina, Mercer, UT Chattanooga, VMI, Samford, they're all doing really, really well. And for a wide variety of reasons, we think all of those should be, thought about in terms of the top quality teams we've got this year. And look, even ETSU, I was there last weekend and they look great. So our schools are invested. They're doing things that make sense to be successful in FCS football. And we think we have a really deep and strong conference for sure.
Absolutely. And to that parity, everyone came into the season thinking this was a 2, maybe 3 horse race. Like I think if you polled, I think when you polled everyone, they said, hey, this is Furman, Samford, Mercer, and then everybody else. And I remember talking to Kerwin Bell at Media Day, and he had a smile on his face. He was very happy. He seemed like he knew something that nobody else knew. Like he had a secret. Like we were going to be different. And now you look at what Western Carolina's done this year, being undefeated in conference, 1 loss. You see what Chattanooga is doing this year, and you go, wow, there are 5 teams who are really, really quality teams that people from outside of this conference have to be aware of, because even though Samford has lost some games to those teams who are really good, on any given day, Samford could beat anybody in this conference. So I think that's interesting, but it sets up a situation like you were talking about with Parity, where now when these playoff selection committees, come around, you've almost kind of cannibalized yourself, because you play everybody, and all of these best teams in the conference have to play the other best teams in the conference. So you can have you could have a 2-loss Furman. You could have a 2-loss Western Carolina. You could have a 2-loss Chattanooga. You could have a 2-loss Mercer, and go, wow, they're probably one of the 16 best teams in the country. Projecting them out into the playoffs. It has to be a more transparent or a more like open concept with selection for these playoff teams, in order to really know that your teams are receiving as fair a shot as they probably should?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've been fortunate in my career to actually be part of 2 different NCAA selection processes. I was on the baseball committee, and I was also on the men's hockey committee. And, those 2 sports, I've been through the process of trying to figure out which teams are deserving, which teams are more deserving, and trying to make sure that everybody gets a fair consideration. And, I always felt like when you got down to those last few spots, those were the toughest decisions you had to make. You can talk about, who's seated where and who travels where, but the cut line of if you don't make the tournament, none of that matters. You can talk about all those different things. So I always felt a huge responsibility when you got to those last spots to make sure that we were really making good discerning judgments, because you've got student athletes at each of those institutions whose hopes and dreams as it relates to a chance to win a national championship are in your hands. And so the issue of transparency is an interesting one. I'm sure within the room and within the decision makers, there's a lot of transparency. They've got ongoing meetings throughout the year. They're having in-depth dialogue about why certain teams make sense and why others don't. And there's a good awareness of the factors that are leading to their judgments. Personally, I'm a data guy. I lean heavily on data. And I think data is a really interesting thing, because it can be like a lamppost. In some cases, people like to use data to support themselves and support their arguments. And in other cases, they want to use data for illumination. And figuring out, the approach that people are taking, are they trying to back up their choices, or are they trying to actually come to the right choice and the right decision, is one that each committee member has to grapple with and wrestle with. So, that's a long way of saying, we've got a lot of information that we are collecting, that we are sharing. We meet weekly, and we are and will meet weekly with our representative who has the responsibility for tracking the SoCon, the representative from the committee. And I'm confident that we will put forward a very compelling argument related to why we think that our conference is deserving of a significant number of bids in the process. and it has to do with a wide variety of things. It has to do with strength of schedule. It has to do with who people have played. It has to do with rankings. The polls are interesting as we talk about data. The selection process is permitted to use the FCS polls, the media poll and the coaches poll. And there's some challenges with that I think are probably worthy of discussion. One, in the media poll, different conferences have different levels of representation as it relates to who's covering which conferences. And I think that's something that if you're going to use that as a selection criteria, you probably need to balance out. The coaches poll has that. I think the other thing is, you talk about transparency. A tool that we're going to use, or the committee's going to use, I should say, to make those selections really should be thinking about what are the obligations to disclose the way people are voting. So if you're going to use a poll, having an understanding of what every single one of those voters has voted and how they have voted, I think is very important, because we have seen, not necessarily at the FCS level, but certainly at the FBS level, people who will vote in particular ways that don't necessarily align with what the overarching thought process is, because they know how the math in the poll works, and will make some votes in ways that may not necessarily be accurate or reflective. You've also seen situations where you've got head-to-head matchups. Teams will play each other, and then despite the fact that the lower-ranked team will beat the higher-ranked team, that team that beat the lower-ranked team that beat the higher-ranked team somehow doesn't pass that team in the rankings. Especially after they played right after that week, and those are hard to understand. Again, I like using data to understand who should be part of the process and to inform decision making. So having awareness of how people are thinking about these things by understanding what their actual votes are, I think, is a very helpful piece of the equation that goes to your question of transparency.
And what are your thoughts about bidding for the home seed to be able to host a playoff game? I know that there's you have to put not a bid, I guess, but you have to put your intentions in, and there's some qualifications that come with hosting. Do you think that should be the case, or do you think it should just be, hey, if you're the higher seeded team, you host, and that's that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We all deal with economic realities within our athletic departments, within our conferences, and the NCAA has economic realities as well. Putting on championships is expensive. Traveling and air charter, restaurants, hotels, all of those are real costs related to conducting a championship of this magnitude and this size. And so I do think there is value in having some type of economic component in this process. The challenge that you get is that, this first round of competition happens on Thanksgiving weekend. And, that is not great timing for fan attendance, particularly student attendance. And I think presents some challenges probably for a lot of institutions in ways that maybe makes them pause regarding the willingness to submit a bid, or maybe they submit a bid, but they do so knowing that, hey, we really want to support our team, but some of the guarantee expectations may be tough to meet, and they might actually have to absorb some expenses themselves in order to get that game if their team is ranked high enough and seated high enough. So, that's a tough question. Look, the bottom line, there are business aspects to what we do. You've got to be able to pay for these things, and some type of economic opportunity or economic payment for the ability to do this, I do think should be a part of the criteria. What's the cut line? How much should it be? I'll leave that to others who have a lot more knowledge than me to decide. But, ideally, and in the best set of circumstances, the top teams who have earned the opportunity to host would get to do so. It's incumbent on those institutions, though, to make sure that they've got the economic ability to do it. They've got the staffing to do it, that there's hotels available for the traveling team and the fans, because this is also part of a championship experience for our athletes and our coaches, and you want it to be a top-notch experience. So going through that process and that exercise is certainly worthwhile for all the reasons that I mentioned.
And I'm going to get you out on this because you have the marquee game of the nation, in my opinion, this weekend. Furman traveling to Western Carolina for a matchup that I believe has a chance to decide the SoCon. If Western Carolina wins, I find it hard to believe they lose 2 games. If Furman wins, I don't think there's anyone else on their schedule that they're not going to be favored to win. I think they have Chattanooga still on the schedule, but I think if you held me down right now and said which one you're choosing, I'm probably choosing Furman. So a marquee game brings in national attention, brings in national eyes. What does a game like this mean for the conference?
Well, it's a great question. We started out this conversation talking about parity in the conference. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that the team that wins this weekend will ultimately emerge as a conference champion, but they certainly put themselves in the driver's seat. But we got a lot of football to play. It's a reflection of a couple of things. One, obviously the quality of the teams that are playing. Those coaches, those athletes are heavily invested in what they're doing. And it's hard to win a title. I mean, we've got 9 teams in our conference. If all things are equal, you got a 1 in 9 chance, and you got to prove it week after week after week after week. I mean, the intensity, the focus, the attention to detail, you don't get a chance to slip up on it. So, these games are easy to get up for. The fan bases will be into it. The nation paying attention to it is great. And it's an opportunity for us to say, hey, we're right in the conversation nationally and deserve to have every ounce of consideration that we're going to get this weekend carried forward for the rest of the year. But it really extends to some of the other teams as well. They've had to go and beat tough teams. Our schools have had to beat tough teams on the road. And they've tested themselves. They've tested themselves in significant ways. Our top 5 teams in the conference are 7-1 against FCS opponents. We've gone out, and the games we've had and the opportunities we've had, we've demonstrated what we can do. And now they got to prove it against themselves. It'll be an exciting weekend for sure. It's great to have the attention. And, if you're a fan of FCS football, if you're a fan of SoCon football, SoCon Saturdays this weekend will certainly have an extra added measure of emphasis and enthusiasm, without a doubt.
Absolutely. Well, Commissioner Cross, I really do appreciate you joining me. Great, by the way, great commissioner answer at the beginning of that, to not really hedge your bet on which way you were going. I was trying to slip one in there on you, but I appreciate it. And good luck this weekend. I hope for health. I hope for a great turnout to the event, and really looking forward to seeing how that game and then the rest of the SoCon season plays out.
Thanks, Gene. Thanks for the opportunity. Great to talk with you, and look forward to doing it again. Have a great weekend.
You as well. Thank you.
Be well.